Hello and welcome. You're listening to Love-Driven Politics, a conversation inviting you to engage the public value of love, compassion, generosity, forgiveness, mercy, and justice. I'm David Kyuman Kim, your host and professor of religious studies and American studies at Connecticut College. We're brought to you by Meaning of Life TV and recording today at my home institution, Connecticut College. It's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Eboo Patel, the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, the Chicago-based hub dedicated to advancing a public curriculum on interfaith studies. Patel is the author of 3 books: the memoir Acts of Faith, the story of an American Muslim and the struggle for the soul of a generation, Sacred Ground, Pluralism, Prejudice, and the Promise of America, and finally, Interfaith Leadership, a primer, all published by Beacon Press. Welcome, Eboo.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. You know, I want to hear a lot of things, but I want to hear more. Start with hearing about you. And, how, your background and how you came to the work.
Sure. So I grew up in an immigrant family, largely in Glen Ellen, which is a western suburb of Chicago. My parents are Ismaili Muslim immigrants from India. They came to the United States for higher education. My dad got an MBA at Notre Dame, worked in corporate advertising for a good long time, and then decided he was done with the rat race. His line was, even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat, and went into small businesses. My mom is a professor of accounting at a community college. I grew up in what I would say a household in which religion was always present in the air. We said Bismillah before meals, but we didn't always make it to Jamaat Khana, which is the Ismaili Muslim house of worship. The real religion in our home was American achievement, doing really well in school and preparing for hopefully a successful professional career. Went to the University of Illinois in the early to mid 1990s. I got politicized there. It was an inflection point in the multicultural movement, the mid-90s moment of identity politics, and I was deeply involved in that. The way that I think about it is that I had kind of swallowed the pill of white supremacy, if you will, growing up in the western suburbs of Chicago as a brown kid trying to be white, and I didn't realize that at the time. It was in kind of an invisible manner in which I operated in the world. And it was when it was made visible to me in college through multiculturalism and identity politics, I then swallowed that pill whole. Right. At some point, I start recognizing that for all that I am talking about identity and diversity issues, I am almost never thinking or talking about religion. And a set of people who I came to admire over the course of my college career, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., Cornel West, I recognize that one of the things that they have in common is a deep well of faith. Right. And it strikes me that religious identity and diversity plays a significant role in the world. Often the manner in which it's reported is in ugly ways, tension and conflict and violence, but it was also the source for many of my social justice heroes. And that was my entree into issues of religious identity and diversity. Right. It was a short hop from there to start thinking about what ways could I be involved that engaged diversity, religion, social justice, young people, and the notion of a project that brought young people from different religious backgrounds together in social action projects that operated on the common values across those religious traditions, and that included a reflection or storytelling component that kind of emerges in the late 1990s. And then honestly, for the last 20 years, it has been that kernel of a concrete idea becoming more and more and more ambitious into what is now Interfaith Youth Corps, which is a 45-person operation based in Chicago that works largely with U.S. residential higher education to help college campuses become ecosystems of interfaith cooperation, launch a new generation of interfaith leaders. That's the medium-length version of my story. I hope it wasn't too boring.
No.
I started to bore myself.
We're gonna break that down, but I want to actually dig back earlier. And so, as you said, much of your work focuses on questions and challenges of identity. You and I are both beneficiaries of the 1965 Immigration Act. I as a first-generation immigrant, you as a second-generation immigrant. there's an argument to be made that the 65 Immigration Act was the most important civil rights act in the 60s, beyond the Civil Rights Act and beyond the Voting Rights Act, because of the ways it changed America, because of the ways it changed the demographics. So I'm curious for you, given that fact, right, and sort of as a child of immigrants, how do you begin to think about the challenges of civil rights and begin to think about the challenges, again, these identity challenges, differently if we think, well, immigration is the driver here?
Right. So I think there's a couple parts to that. So number one, I think it's interesting to frame the 65 Immigration Act as a civil rights act, which I think is, if that is the case, it is frankly another example of the generosity of the African-American led civil rights movement. They had every reason to think only about themselves, and they didn't. And that is stunning, right? The second thing I have to say about that is, as grateful as I am to be in the United States, and I am deeply grateful, and so is my family. I think that there were many, many more important things that happened in the civil rights movement for a population that had been in this country and then had been oppressed and marginalized for centuries. So I would consider myself fortunate if those of us who were able to come as a result of the 65 Immigration Act were framed as part of the civil rights movement, and then we have to then take on the responsibility of what do we owe to that fact. So the third part of this is a brief story, which is last August in Chicago, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Fair Housing March in Marquette Park, where he famously marches in Marquette Park with 700 peaceful demonstrators, and there are 5,000 people who come out and demonstrate against him.
That's right.
And they throw rocks and bottles and yell racial slurs. And King gets hit in the head with a brick, and he keeps walking. And in a lot of ways, that march, that inspires Harold Washington and Operation Breadbasket, which leads to the election of Harold Washington in the early 80s as the first black mayor of Chicago. Of course, a young Barack Obama arrives in Chicago not long after, is inspired by seeing Harold's picture in every barbershop and home on the South Side, thinks maybe one day I could be mayor of Chicago. We know how that turned out. And as I'm marching with my family in this 50th anniversary commemoration march, I am struck by a couple things. Number one, the commemoration is led by a Muslim organization called the Inner City Muslim Action Network, and it is so inspiring to me to think that this Muslim organization feels itself spiritually and materially connected to what King did 50 years ago, knowing that this fair housing march that King led allowed this group of Palestinian Arabs, this group of South Asians like myself, to be able to rent apartments and buy homes in Chicago 10, 15, 20 years later. My parents moved to Rogers Park on the other side of the city in the late 1970s. They were able to get an apartment. I thought to myself, if King hadn't been here in 1966, getting hit with a brick in the head, it might not have at least slightly eroded the practice of redlining.
So you see yourself standing in that tradition of civil rights. You see yourself standing in the traditions of freedom fighters.
I see myself primarily as the beneficiary of the work that they have done, and therefore I feel like I have some responsibility to it. I don't think that I get to say that I stand in that tradition. I think I get to say thank you for what your blood, sweat, tears, and martyrdoms bequeathed to me. What do I owe? What do I owe you and the future in return?
So I would say for myself that I do feel myself standing in that tradition. And here the break from, what would you call it, a certain kind of identity politics is an important one. So I mean, I'm thinking of your own work in interfaith studies and kind of intercultural engagements. And so that, that account of this 50th anniversary march being led by Muslim Americans is moving and actually telling about our moment. So, if one could argue that only a Christian could have led the civil rights movement, let alone a black Christian, can we make the argument, or an argument, that the successors to that tradition and the successors to the movement now may actually very well be Muslim, brown, Asian, so on? Or are we not there yet?
So I think that if there is a tradition that that I seek to extend in America, it's probably the tradition of pluralism, of which the civil rights and social justice work is a different but overlapping circle. So when I speak of the tradition of pluralism, I think about George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, not far from where we sit right now, when he writes to a Jewish leader that this government will give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. Now, at the same time, of course, Washington was owning slaves.
That's right.
And so that's a deep contradiction. And at the same time, he was standing up for a Jewish community. I think about Abraham Lincoln standing up against the anti-Catholic Know Nothing Party. I think about Jane Addams and Hull House. I think about the first parliament of the world's religion. So that is a tradition of American religious pluralism, which is a tradition of how can people who orient around religion differently, with different doctrines, with oftentimes different social views, work together for some version of the common good. The civil rights tradition and social justice tradition overlaps with that profoundly, because part of what King was able to do was to build a coalition of people from a range of religious backgrounds, highlighting the dimensions of the common good and the definitions of justice that they agreed on. And they didn't agree on all of them. They agreed on some of them. King was able to de-emphasize the parts that they disagreed on, to raise up the parts that they agreed upon, and to win a set of concrete things as a result of that. I would like to think that IFYC is attempting to extend some version of both of those.
Right. So there's a tradition of religious pluralism that doesn't travel necessarily through Washington and Lincoln, as you just described, or Jane Addams, but starts with someone like Roger Williams. Right. So Williams flees, somewhat ironically, Massachusetts because of the persecution he's experiencing there, and founds Rhode Island as a laboratory, as it were, for religious pluralism. But the difference being not about consensus. So the primary principle for Williams is acts of conscience.
Right.
Right. So that one of the arguments one can make about American religious pluralism, and one of the arguments that you can make in regard to honoring different traditions, is to understand that acts of conscience lie at the heart of it, not acts of consensus. So
Yes.
I'm curious about how your work in interfaith studies deals with that, but that particularly in this moment that's so rife with a certain kind of turmoil around religion.
So I think this is fascinating. Thank you for bringing this up. So what is necessary to have a nation? Can you have 320 million people or 10,000 various communities going their separate ways and not having what Justice Felix Frankfurter called cohesive sentiment, the idea of a nation? Is there not great value to conversations, some version of consensus about the common good on everything from safe neighborhoods to well-paved roads to good public schools? How does one account for avenues of conscience which might take some people or communities awry, so to speak, or away, and this sense of the public good? So, of course, there's a number of Supreme Court cases along these lines. Amongst the most famous are there are laws in most states that you have to stay in school until you're 16. Is it a matter of freedom of conscience that the Amish community says we would like to remove for the purpose of the continuity of our identity community, we'd like to remove our kids from the public school system at 13? Mm-hmm. Is the highest value there freedom of conscience, or is the highest value there we have a nation in which there is an across the board understanding of the level of school education mm-hmm. that needs to take place in order to be within the law? And then you can actually push this example. What if a community says we'd like to remove our girls mm-hmm. at the age of 13 mm-hmm. because we don't want them socialized into Western and American understandings of being women. Mm-hmm. We have a different socialization process, let's say in this Orthodox Jewish or in this Muslim community. Mm-hmm. Is that an example of conscience, or is that a violation of the public consensus around gender equity in the United States?
But surely it's both, right?
Surely
it's both, and that the operation of conscience shouldn't have to come at the price of the obligation to the state, right?
Or to what Jeffrey Stock calls the civic nation. I mean, let's forget the government here. Yeah. Let's say what we would like to think we have collectively decided about what it means to be part of the civic nation.
Sure, but we're pushing here to figure out what are the conditions that allow for some kind of contestation such that the integrity of faith, the integrity of culture, the integrity of identity are not so thoroughly compromised. You can't have them uncompromised, but they're not so thoroughly compromised that acts of conscience will always be subsumed to one's identification with whether it's a civic nation or the actual, nation state.
I'm fascinated by these questions. So when a Jehovah's Witness refuses to accept a blood transfusion for a life-saving surgery, mm-hmm. is that an act of conscience or an act of suicide, which is actually mm-hmm. illegal? Mm-hmm. What happens when a Jehovah's Witness refuses that for his or her children?
What if you took the word conscience out and, not for nothing, you call it an act of faith?
So I think that's exactly. I'm using these terms actually right now synonymously. Right. I guess what I am saying is, what happens when I am generally progressive mm-hmm. on social and political matters. Mm-hmm. So I applaud when the Supreme Court decides that Muhammad Ali mm-hmm. does not have to go to the Vietnam War.
Yep.
When he is allowed to raise a conscientious objector mm-hmm. status objection. Yep. And he wins his case in the late 1960s, right? I applaud that. Mm-hmm. Do I applaud when a religious community claims active conscience and takes their girls out of school? Do I applaud when a religious college claims an act of conscience and sues the Obama administration mm-hmm. over the contraception requirement in Obamacare? The principle here is the same, which is that a community gets to have a particular identity and to claim an exception to a prevailing view, either mm-hmm. by the civic nation or by the state, mm-hmm. by claiming an act of conscience. Do I only applaud when that view happens to be in line with my own?
No, of course not. Right, and the celebration of that alignment would be an undermining of democracy. Right, I mean, so how do I put this? If it's the case that each of our identities are always multiply constituted, meaning that we draw down not just from one tradition or one, using the faith as a metaphor here, one faith, but really, I mean, because what you're describing in regard to acts of conscience, acts of faith, in conjunction or at odds with acts of, say, loyalty to the civic nation,
or it's actually not it's prevailing norms. It's prevailing norms.
But of course, I mean, we were talking about the civil rights movement earlier. The civil rights movement would be nothing if it did not resist prevailing norms and
Right.
to understand that the prevailing norms, say, of white supremacy, had not just to be thwarted, but to be actively and persistently and consistently resisted.
Yes. And what happens when a community seeks to abstain from prevailing norms that it turns out that I actually agree with? So, for example, there would be several religious communities who would want to gender segregate education. It is the prevailing norm in the United States to the point where we don't even think about it. It's like oxygen in the air, right? We recognize we need it to live, but nobody walks around thinking, "Oh, thank you for that gulp of oxygen air," right?
Although these days one probably should
right, exactly.
be thinking about that.
What happens when communities based on a particular identity, whether it's faith or race or ethnicity, seek exceptions to prevailing norms that I actually agree with or that you might agree with? Which exceptions ought those communities be granted and which shouldn't they be? And they often point out, wait a second, you are very happy to grant exceptions to the prevailing norms you don't like under the rubric or justification, acts of conscience or identity claims.
Right.
Why are you so loath to grant exceptions to the prevailing norms that you do like based on the same justification?
Right. So, look, inconsistencies happen all the time, right? And
but we intellectuals ought to point them out.
well, no, you point them out. However, so just to use the civil rights example again, that the pushback of King, the pushback of Abernathy and Vincent Harding and Fannie Lou Hamer was to take the exception to those prevailing norms and to make those exceptions the rule. Right? So that, to advocate for the dignity of all human beings, of all citizens, or to elevate and to expand the meaning of citizenship in a context in which white supremacy would say, look, no. And so, the prevailing norm, I mean, it's not even just the rigor, but the ferocity of that no. The using conscience, and, the Ali example is a good one, right? So that, it's hard to imagine a national celebration of a conscientious objector in 2017. Right. And who wasn't fully celebrated, of course.
Keep going.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about the transition. So Ali's resistance, that act of conscientious objection happens in the 60s. 50 years later, certain kinds of militarism have been normalized. Certain kinds of perceptions and recognition of the military have changed. And so, the role of conscientious objectors is a different one. But I think in many ways even more pressing now.
So I think the Ali example as conscientious objector, there's a way to understand it in perhaps a different narrative arc, which is, here is somebody who was vilified by large swaths of America in, what was it, 67 or 68, when he makes what by any measure is a stunningly courageous stand, right? Absolutely. He's in the prime of his fighting career. I believe he's heavyweight champion of the world at the point, right? I just re-saw the film. And he says, I'm not going to Vietnam. Why would I go? They never called me the N-word, right? He gets convicted. He gets a 5-year jail sentence. He has to drop his heavyweight title. He can't fight for over 2 years, right? He is roundly vilified, except in certain progressive quarters of America by African Americans and by Muslims, right? And at that point, of course, he's a Muslim. And then 50 years later, he is roundly celebrated, right? He hasn't, to my knowledge, at least gone back on that conviction. He never said what I did was wrong. It is America that changed.
But do you think he was celebrated for that?
Well, it was certainly a part of the package, right? In other words, look, I cannot remember, except for Ronald Reagan in recent memory, an American who has had what was a state funeral. That was
no, that I agree with. But I guess the question is, like, do you think he was celebrated for being a conscientious objector, or the fact that he was this celebrity? Really,
there was so much press that couldn't be ignored. I mean, the cable news had to fill the time, right? And I find that actually one of the great stories of change in American history. Right? And part of this is Ali. Ali, he gets older, and I don't think he softens his opinions or positions, but he softens his style. I don't think that is to get on TV more. Yep. I think that's what's happens to a lot of people when they get older, right? He holds the torch at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996, so that's 30 years later. Yep. And then 45, 50 years later, when he passes away, I mean, every cable news network, I think maybe except for Fox, shows the entirety of the funeral. Bill Clinton speaks, right? It is presided over by imams. It seems to me that this is a story of an America who is able to who has different frames to understand a character like Ali.
So let's use that to talk about America of 2017. You identify as a multiracial progressive, as a Muslim American. How are you contending with this moment? In a moment defined by a presidency that is, with a fair degree of consistency, xenophobic, racist, sometimes outright white supremacists.
Absolutely.
So I'm because you said earlier that again, that story about the 50th anniversary of the King March being led by a Muslim American. How do you contend with this moment? How do you and as a kind of the publicness, how the publicness of what it is to be a Muslim American changed in November of 2016?
Right. So the last 6 months, I have twisted and turned an awful lot deep into the night. It has been tumultuous and there have been times of trauma, and I am privileged enough to not be anywhere close to the crosshairs of this, right? So I'm a citizen. I'm lucky enough to have an excellent job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When I stand on the perch of that privilege, and not everybody has it, but when I stand on the perch of that privilege, I recognize this as a moment of great opportunity. Again, if I lived in a neighborhood whose public school could be wrecked by certain policies, if I didn't have citizenship status, if my parents didn't, I would likely feel very differently. But I'm going to use my privilege for a moment and and say out loud what is happening in the administration and in the orbits around the administration is so odious that lots of people who might be in the broad sphere of more conservative politics or religiosity are thinking to themselves, at least with some of the voices in their head, I don't want to be associated with that. Right. I think the question then, for me, for the kind of leader and organizer that I am, is how do I widen my circle to be more inclusive of those people? So in my mind, this is a persuasion moment. It is not a declaration and disdain moment.
Persuasion towards what? Maybe that's a question.
Persuasion towards what King would call the beloved community, right? Persuasion towards a civic nation that achieves what we at Interfaith Youth Corps call pluralism,
Right.
which is respect for diverse identities, relationships between different communities, and conversations and commitment to some understanding of the common good.
Yep.
So what we talk a lot about at IFYC, another way of saying that is how do you build a healthy, religiously diverse democracy? Because we're the Interfaith Youth Corps, religious identity is especially salient for us. It's of course we mean also racially, gender diversity, ethnicity, sexual identity, etc. We deal particularly with the interesting challenges around religious diversity, right? How do you build a society in which diversity is not just the differences you like?
Yeah.
Right? Diversity also means identities with which you might have less affinity with, differences that you might find at times offensive and challenging. I think a big question for this moment is, are we building pure paths or big tents? And I am a big tent person.
So what if your tent isn't bulletproof? Isn't, in the sense of, I'm thinking, I've thought a lot about this question about the challenges of the beloved community in the Trump era. And I know you've written recently about James Baldwin and Tony Kushner and Angels in America. And I've been thinking about the challenges both in The Fire Next Time and in Angels in America. Is this problematic where, what is it to love a country that doesn't love you back?
Yeah. I mean,
Which reverts to this question of the beloved community, because the beloved community is a community that feels loved.
Right. So I understand that there are lots of people who might feel in that position. I don't. Right. And listen, there's lots of countries that do not allow first-generation immigrants to become citizens. It is actually a remarkable thing that you can move to the United States and acquire citizenship and do everything minus run for president. I think to myself, in any objective rendering of my personal story, this is not everybody's personal story, but mine. I mean, I think sometimes, has a nation ever been as good to a second-generation immigrant as it's been to me? When I was 21 and applying for a Rhodes Scholarship, somebody told me like 3 weeks away from the application deadline that you had to be a citizen to apply. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not a citizen, I'm a permanent resident. I'd never gone through the citizen process. I called my local congressperson's office and told them my situation, that I was applying for a Rhodes and that I needed to expedite the citizenship process. And they turned it around a week later. And the congressperson's staff was like, good luck to you. We're proud of you for even getting this far. This is not everybody's story, but it is my story, right? And so that doesn't mean that I didn't experience taunts on the playground. Right. That didn't mean that I didn't feel that brown skin was ugly growing up. But it is also true that my congressman turned around a citizenship application. He didn't have to do that, right? How do I understand that as anything but love? When I was starting Interfaith Youth Corps, the Ford Foundation didn't have to give us a grant, right? The Chicago Community Trust didn't have to give us a grant. So gratitude does not equal blind nationalism, right? And Baldwin, who might be my single favorite nonfiction author, would often say, because I love America more than any other country in the world, I insist on criticizing her perpetually. Baldwin was a gay black man in the 1950s, right? He was marginalized in all kinds of ways. He knew the business end of the police baton in Harlem. I am a second generation voluntary immigrant in 20th century America, I have basically only known American largesse. So I would say I love America more than any other country on the planet. How do I work to improve her from the position that I am in, recognizing that there's lots of other positions?
But how do you speak that to folks who are not as fulsome recipients of that largesse?
Yes.
That are more, so I'm thinking the dreamer that was recently taken from his home and deported, DACA student, right?
Yeah.
And, his congressman or congresswoman didn't say, I love you and I'm going to make sure that you get brought back. When ICE picked him up, he was literally thrown over the border.
Yeah, I find that absolutely egregious, right? Which is why I want to recognize that your original question was a personal question about some version of, do you feel like this country loves you back? My response to that is absolutely. That doesn't mean that there haven't been thorny parts of my story, right? Like, try growing up with the name Eboo in the white western suburbs of Chicago in the 1980s. But when I think about...
For me, it was Kyuman, but we'll go with
Right. When I think about being taunted in 7th grade over my name versus all the variety of other things that I have experienced, those other things win in my own personal story. I want to recognize, as I hope I have throughout this conversation, that there are lots and lots of other positions. 99% of positions in America are less privileged than mine. I don't want to lie about when I ask about my own position, I want to give a straight answer. And I think other people get to define how they feel in their position. And I feel like part of what I owe everybody, from George Washington to Jane Addams to Martin Luther King Jr., right? Like this, to Muhammad Ali, to this vast array of Americans, known and unknown, who created a country that some people benefit from and other people benefit from less. I would like to expand the fruits of the nation. I happen to expand from a position of gratitude and privilege, right? And so I use the words improve, participate in the nation's progress, carve a place in its promise. I don't think that the trajectory I imagine is dramatically different than lots of other social action activists. I just think that the tone and style in which I do my work might be a little bit different. Part of it is because, honestly, when I was 20 and first getting politicized, and I insisted to my dad, and in the living room of our comfortable home in the leafy suburb of Chicago, that we were oppressed, he looked at me and he said, what percentage of the world would trade places with you? And if you think we're oppressed, what word do you have for them? That's a very good question, right? So I need to be honest about my position, which is a position of stunning privilege, much of it given, a little of it earned, and base a disposition off of that. My disposition, part of this is based on the privilege, part of it is based on how I read Islam, part of it is based on just, I think, my psychological makeup. I am a person who is grateful of where I'm at. I'm a person who thinks that, generally speaking, a positive tone in social action work is more likely to be persuasive than a negative tone. I think that social action work is the work of persuasion, not the work of declaration and disdain.
One of the things we talk about in love-driven politics is, to your point about persuasion, that the invitation should be, isn't always, should be an act of love, where you're making a promise to find time and make space to be with another, not for the sense of agreement, but the need for that, if that we're really going to change the culture, we're going to really transform lives. We want to end with this. I mean, what's sustaining your faith in what you just described, right? I mean, you talked about what constitutes you, but I mean, and yesterday in the lecture you gave here at the college, you spoke of these lanterns, from Dorothy Day and King and Gandhi and Jane Addams, Woody Guthrie. I mean, who are the lanterns, or who are the heroes now that are the stewards of a tradition that you're forging?
I mean, that's a great. So I feel so blessed to be in community with a lot of these people. Mm-hmm. You, my colleague Noah, who's here, mm-hmm. Rami Neshashibi of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, Valerie Kaur. Mm-hmm. There's lots and lots and mm-hmm. lots of these people. I mean, I'm on probably 20 or 25 campuses a year. Mm-hmm. I love meeting people who nobody else has ever heard of, who are like running the service learning program at mm-hmm. Connecticut College, mm-hmm. And are bringing 19-year-old college students to tutor in New London schools, mm-hmm. right? I mean, I love that, right? Mm-hmm. I love these, in Islam, Rahmah, mercy is the chief value. I love these little acts of mercy. I think I am so I'm inspired by grand narratives. Mm-hmm. I'm inspired by archetypal figures like Dorothy Day and Martin mm-hmm. Luther King Jr., right? And I am inspired by little acts of mercy that people do even mm-hmm. though they don't have to, mm-hmm. right? Every time a kid is nice to another kid in the playground, absolutely. I collect that. I love that, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, I actually trace it back to the grand narrative of Islam. And I find the kind of things that I see every day and connected to great stories from the Quran or the Prophet Muhammad. So I'll end with one. So I told a story last night of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, right? And so when the Prophet Muhammad leads his companions back to the city of Mecca, and I believe the year 629 to do the Umrah, there's a story that he sees along the path of the caravan. And you can imagine there's thousands of people and there's animals that are making this large trek from Medina to Mecca, right? It is no small effort. He sees in the path of the caravan, hundreds of yards or a half a mile or whatever up the road, there is a dog and her pups. And he can see that the caravan is traveling a course that is going to run over the dog and her pups. Mm. And he doesn't want that to happen. So he shifts the course of the caravan so it goes around this dog and her pups. Mm. And I find that so moving, right? I find that so moving that he didn't think to himself, well, that's just collateral damage. Right. I mean, we have, thousands of people and whatever, hundreds of animals, and, it's this dog and her pups. They're either going to get trampled or they'll figure that it's their problem. He doesn't go and try to scooch the dog and her pups out of the way, mm-hmm. right? He recognizes that this is a nurturing moment. Mm-hmm. These pups have just been born. They need their mom, mm-hmm. right? And so he takes it upon himself to organize this great inconvenience of shifting the caravan. And in that process, he teaches mercy, right? Mm-hmm. Like when you see a vulnerable group up front, right, you take the effort, you accept the inconvenience of moving a little bit so that group can feel safe and so that you can do that act of mercy, right? I love those stories, and I literally walk in life collecting them.
I love that story as well, and I so appreciate your honoring and respecting the everyday people, everyday acts, though not just to defer to the grand gesture, the grand narrative, the archetype, but to understand that if we're going to be successful in the kind of acts of generosity and mercy you're talking about, if we're going to be successful in love-driven politics, it has to find its way into the lives of everyday people. Eboo, you're a warrior for love and generosity. I so appreciate you and so appreciate your time. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Such great fun, David.
Okay, thank you.